So architecture, this is firm. Why did I put that picture up there? Because one of the things that I learned about him when I went to see him was how important relationships are to him. He believes in long-term relationships, and most of those people have been with him at least 16 years. And he's got a handful that are still there the entire 29 years he's been in business, and that's been since he's graduated. So I'm telling you some of these things because I want to prepare you for what you should be thinking about. Why is he giving this particular presentation? Because as you know, architecture is oftentimes described as the art and science of building. And most of the time when you hear someone talking about architecture, they talk about the art, the beautiful things. He left the beautiful things out, so I'm going to show you a few things. He's going to talk to you about the science of architecture. And I think that's a key ingredient that made him most extraordinarily successful. But here's some art that he's not showing you. This is a beautiful design of, you never heard of automotive architecture. I didn't until I went to see it. It's actually a distinct type of architecture. This is an Audi facility. We saw another one under construction. This is the interiors. One of this auto facilities, it's called an auto store, not a dealership. And it has some extraordinary things. He can talk to you about that later on. It's pretty amazing. And then you have another interesting, beautiful interiors of a little mini. His architecture and his firm is called Spring Engineering. One of the things up there involves architecture, engineering, land development, and specializations in LEED. All of y'all know what LEED is, right? Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And you can see one of his most outstanding projects he's going to talk about today is a shelter that no one else in the country said they could build, and he did it. So there's another beautiful thing now. So that's Vitruvius. So if you notice, Vitruvius said there's three things: scholarship, commitment, and then the substance comes from the two of those. And I think you're going to see in his work, there's scholarship, there's substance, and there's a commitment that sort of ties in very closely to the work ethic that I think you're going to see and realize when he talks about what he did. So, he's a leader in life, a leader by example, and a leader in the field. And by way of science in architecture, I think sets him apart from many others. And as you know, we're in this College of Science and Technology. So without further ado, the lecture is, you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And that should prompt you to think, what does that mean? And I think Mr. Bekesh is going to tell us all about that. So without further ado, I welcome Mr. Bekesh to the presentation today. I give you the mic, or you can mute it.
Hi, thank you. Guys, it's great to be here with you. It's been 30 years since I left the Southern Miss campus, so this is my first time back since the day I graduated. So I'm happy to be back. I'm excited to talk with all of you today. And Dr. Cannell, thank you. Where did you run off to? Thank you for the nice introduction. Thank you for inviting me back. And a special thanks to Amanda. Where's she at in here? Amanda, thank you for all your efforts to help put this together. Please give her a round of applause. Learn how anal I can be in terms of preparation. So when we design buildings and something goes wrong, we can kill someone. So we become very anal about things. And we like to do pre-mortems instead of post-mortems with things. So my theme today has to do with something that I reinforce with my senior management team every single month when we meet. And that's this concept of you don't know what you don't know. And so I have 35 wonderful, very talented, highly educated staff. And there's 7 of them who are on my senior management team, all with advanced degrees. And sometimes they get caught up in this thing that I like to call cognitive rigidity. Does anyone know what that means, cognitive rigidity? It's this concept of you view things through a very narrow lens. You have what we call organizational bias. So some of you guys are in interior design, some of you are in construction, some of you are in architecture. And so you tend to view things through that industrial paradigm. What I tell my folks is, you've got to look at things through a broader lens. You can't analyze things with that industrial bias because when you go out in the workforce, corporations and employers are wanting to look for folks that solve problems. If you're going to just stay within your lanes and in the industry paradigms, what tends to happen? They can find someone cheaper, or they can find a machine to replace it. So corporations today are looking for folks that are problem solvers. They're looking for folks with strong minds who are wanting to have unique, collaborative solutions. Folks that are focused on positive outcomes for their organization. And that's what they want to hire. That's what this is going to be about today. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to give you some real-life examples of how this works and what I've seen over the last 30 years in my career. Because it seems as though when I work with large corporations, some of the most sophisticated corporations in America, they seem to be the ones that have the biggest issue with this. Why do you think that is? Any guesses? It's because they fall within the paradigms of their industry. And they don't have young minds to look outside of those lanes and conceive that there could be other solutions to problems besides the ones in their industry. So that's what this is about. So being an architect, I love graphics. So I had to bring an important graphic here. So imagine for a minute that this graph represents all the possible knowledge you could have. 5% roughly would be the things you know, right? You know how to drive a car, I hope. You know how to speak English. Some of you might know AutoCAD. Those are the things you know. 15% roughly are the things we know we don't know, right? You can't fly a jet airplane. You might not be able to speak Japanese. If you're me, you can't do Revit. How many people in the room know Revit? So my staff knows Revit, but I don't know Revit yet, so I'm working on that. So those are the things we know we don't know. What's the other 80%? We don't know what we don't know, right? And it's a pretty common sense idea. But let me give you, as I was flying over here, and I've had an interesting day because of some plane difficulties, so I was thinking about some real life examples of this. You don't know what you don't know. And recently I was engaged to do some public work for Miami International Airport, and they were delivering their projects through what we call a guaranteed maximum price contract. Do you guys study AIA contracts here? So you're familiar with cost plus GMP contracts? So they were represented by a very prestigious law firm. And their head attorney came from a very prominent law school. And she was familiar with a cost plus GMP contract. It's what we call an AIA 102 contract. When they engaged me, I said to them, you probably shouldn't deliver these projects this way. You should probably deliver them under a competitive bid stipulated sum process, which is totally different than the process they were using, okay? Everyone was on board with that. This attorney, Stacy, came to the first pre-con meeting to meet with the contractor who got the job. She brought to the meeting an AIA 102 contract, which is not the right contract for the process that we use. And the contractor, who was very polite and diplomatic, didn't say a word. It was the shortest meeting I've ever had. He got up, said thank you. He looked at me, and I grabbed Stacy and I said, well, why did you bring that contract? Well, that's the contract we always use, Rich. It's the 102. I said, well, we're not delivering the project that way. Do you know why she did it? Because she didn't know what she didn't know. She had no idea. This is a prominent law school graduate who had never been exposed to a stipulated sum contract. It's shocking. But her firm that she worked for had what we call organizational bias. They had been locked in to the fact that they actually believed. Are you the expert in AIA contracts? Okay, well then you understand what I'm saying. The law firm actually believed in the word GMP. It's a misnomer, the AIA GMP contract. It's not a GMP. But the law firm believed that that really was a guaranteed maximum price contract and they could never go above that. not true. But so you get the point that I'm making. Very well-educated gal, but she just didn't know what she didn't know. Second example, I represent a large auto group in San Antonio, Texas, and we're doing several luxury stores for them right now in that market. They employ about 3,500 people. Annual revenue is about $900 million. I'm in a senior management meeting with them, and they're debating over the length of travel distance for the service riders to get out to your car when you bring it in the service drop. All of you guys have brought your cars in the service department, right? So what they're trying to do is sell you additional service. I'm sure you all know that. And they were debating about having to walk out to check tire tread depth on the cars, and the fact that we had designed it too far apart. And I had to stop for a minute. I said, guys, you realize that we have the technology now. We put the tread depth readers in the concrete. You don't have to walk out anymore to measure the tread depth. This is a $900 million a year company. They just didn't know because they got so caught up in their organizational paradigm. So the important thing here for you guys to understand is that Southern Miss is going to give you a phenomenal critical thinking base when you leave here. I was very well prepared thanks to professors like Mr. Salinas. But it's incumbent upon you to continue learning, to get in the habit of self-teaching. It will never end. And as I go through these examples today, you're going to recognize that. You must continue to self-teach. You must grow your mind and strengthen your mind. Your mind is like a muscle. It has to be challenged. And as you grow in your careers, you're going to be faced with more and more complex challenges. And that's a good thing, because when you elevate in your careers, you want those challenges. But in order to face those challenges, you have to hone and develop your critical thinking skills now. So today, real quickly, I'm going to give you a brief background of my firm and what we didn't know when I started this firm. Essentially, 1 week after graduation, I started this architectural engineering firm. I'm going to profile 3 projects, assuming that we have time, and they're all going to dive deeper into this concept of what, these are all projects that our firm had no experience in, and in some cases didn't even know the terminology when we were faced with them. So real quickly to start off, take a listen to this.
This is not just a school. It's a pillar for tomorrow's generation. This is not just a dealership. It's the keys to the journey ahead. This is not just a fire station. It's where the human spirit sparks. This is not just an architectural and engineering firm. It's the foundation of life. Spring Engineering, where life unfolds one project at a time.
So I started this firm in 1988, and there were 2 critical things that were happening at that time. Anyone remember at the end of 1987, right before I graduated, what was happening in the financial markets? And there was something we called Black Monday. And the financial markets across the world started to collapse, one after another. It was the precursor to the 1990 recession. My firm was about 18 months old when that happened. So it was a startling realization for me, because the construction industry and the architectural industry was basically collapsing. That's one thing that taught us a lot. But the second thing was the fact that the regulations were changing in Florida too. Florida had adopted what we call growth management laws. And the firms that did not get up to speed on the growth management laws were winding down. It became too complex for them. So in Florida, we have things called concurrency. And the idea of private property rights in Florida has long gone away, because we have to justify that we don't impact traffic, stormwater, utility systems, and after we do all those analysis, then we can get permits. And so our firm, it was incumbent upon us to learn those things. They're not things that are taught in school. Now, the recession opened my eyes to 2 things. Number one, and this is important, we couldn't just prepare plans and specs and make it. We had to be innovative with the services we offer. We had to go beyond the traditional boundaries of architecture and engineering. And in a minute, I'm going to dive into that deeper. And then we also recognized another thing, that If we were doing what we call the one-off projects, the bank, the retail center, shopping centers, libraries, what happens when you just do one project? There's a ramp-up effort. So you ramp up, there's a lot of time involved because you have to get to know the client and you have to understand the project. So when you're spending all that time up front, what do you think happens to the fee? You're eating it up in the front of the project. And we wanted to drive our revenues and our profits higher. So we wanted to focus on clients that were doing 10 projects or more. That was a strategy that we had set out on. And the final thing we learned, of course, because I went 31 weeks that particular year in 1991 without a paycheck, is that we were not going to allow that to happen again. We were going to build a recession-proof firm. And we set out to do that. So in 1991, I met this gentleman by the name of Larry Morgan. Larry Morgan had purchased this company, Tires, or Donaldson Tire and Auto. It later became Tires Plus. At the time he purchased the company, there were 35 stores in the Tampa Bay market. He wanted to grow the chain to 1,000 stores, and he wanted to do it in 10 years. And of course, he needed an architect and an engineer to develop the prototypes, and we were the firm selected to do that. But we recognized that Larry needed more than an architect and engineer. He didn't have the human capital in his organization to roll out 1,000 stores. You're talking about over $1 billion in construction value. So we said to Larry, you know what, we have the skill sets. We'll partner with you. We'll be your purchasing department. We'll handle your entitlements, your real estate issues. We'll do all those other things that traditional firms aren't doing. And we started doing that for Morgan. We wound up doing over 700 stores for this gentleman in 23 states, which equates out to about $1.7 billion of construction values that we were responsible for. Now, when we were doing this account, we were discovered by this company. And they said, wow, this firm's doing a lot of work for you guys, and they're doing things that have value. This company started their own rollout. They wanted to do 500 stores in the Southeast United States. They had already embarked on a prototype before they engaged us. Their prototype was not cost efficient. They were having trouble building the prototype, and they needed help. And so we redesigned their prototype. We implemented all the services for that organization that we had done with Tires Plus. We did one thing further with these guys. And this is where this thinking outside the paradigms comes in. They came to me and they said, Rich, we're buying more land than we need. Now think about it. If you're going to do 500 stores, that's 500 sites. Each of the sites costing them about $1.5 million to $2 million a piece. If you're buying too much land, you don't have to be a mathematician to understand you're spending a lot of money just on the dirt. And the reason they were buying more land than they needed is that most municipal codes throughout America put discount auto parts stores, or auto parts stores in general, in the retail category. So the zoning and land use codes in America don't differentiate between auto parts sales and retail sales. So a retail customer would obviously have what? Who's awake? Who remember? What would you have if you're a retailer? You got more parking, right? Auto parts stores don't need the same amount of parking. We said we can help. We'll help you get out of that problem. So we consulted ITE, and we established the protocol to track and map all the parking in 7 of their locations in different geographic regions in the Southeast. Then we built a report and study around it, and we demonstrated to the 67 counties in Florida that their codes were wrong and that they really needed half the parking. And so all of a sudden their sites became half the size. So we saved that company roughly $50 million in acquisition costs. And they could get easily another architect and engineer and replace me, but they couldn't get another architect and engineer to do these things that we're doing that are outside the traditional service. And that's the point here with this. So this company, anyone ever hear of this group? This is Extended Stay America. It's owned by a gentleman. It was owned by a gentleman by the name of Wayne Huizinga. Does anyone recognize that name? There's no football fans in the room. You know who Wayne Huizinga is. I mean, Miami Dolphins. So Wayne Huizinga started Waste Management. He sold Waste Management, and he started Blockbuster Video. He sold that for a couple of $1 billion, and then he started this organization. They were in the same dilemma as the two previous companies. So this is a publicly traded company. This company wanted to be the largest hotel chain in the nation. And it's a little different than most hotel companies because extended stay, every single unit out in America is corporately owned. So when you go to a Holiday Inn or any of the other hotel chains, they're usually franchised. This company was funded it all through the stock market. And they needed our firm to help them roll out across America. We wound up doing several hundred locations for them. Just under $1 billion worth of construction value. And then I put this group in here. I was doing a public hearing in Brunswick, Georgia, and in the back of the room were some guys in suits. And when I was finished doing the presentation, they came over to me and said, look, we'd like to hire you. We're going to do this enormous rollout in America. And sometimes you get that and you just move on because you never hear from them again. We heard from them again. So anyone know Yum Brands? Are you familiar with this company? So Yum Brands was formerly called Tricon Global Restaurants. And Tricon Global Restaurants was owned by Pepsi. And Pepsi used these restaurants to get soda in your hands, basically. It was a conduit to get soda to you. This particular subsidiary became so large, Pepsi said, we're going to spin it off. We're going to give it away, sell it, move on. They spun it off, it became Yum Brands. So the new Yum board of directors, they decide, they have this novel concept, which all of you have probably participated in. And this is them thinking out of the box. They wanted to multi-brand the chain. Does everyone know what multi-branding means? You've been in those restaurants. So before the company was spun off, you either went to Pizza Hut, KFC, you went to individual locations. The new board of directors and CEO, they said, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to multi-brand. We're going to put KFC, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut in one building. We're going to increase our revenues and decrease our costs. They wanted to do that across the country. This was an enormous undertaking. And we were one of 3 AE firms selected to handle their rollout across America. And in addition to all the architectural engineering services we provided, we did all the same entitlement services, purchasing services. And one of the most memorable events that I've ever had is when you work for these large publicly traded companies, you really become an extension of the company. And so they would invite us to their annual meeting. And my two other cohorts, firms, one in Los Angeles, one in New York, that had this account, I had the Southeast, and they had the other regions. They would make each of the principals stand up and introduce themselves. And there was 4,000 or 5,000 people in the auditorium. And my 2 competitors stood up and said, I'm so-and-so with the New York firm. I got 15 offices around the world in Hong Kong. The other guy stands up from Los Angeles. It happened to be Art Gensler's firm. If you guys are familiar with Gensler, you know how many offices he has. And of course, I stand up and I say, I'm from Newport Richey, Florida, I have 35 guys. And the room just burst out because they think I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. I'm handling your Southeast region. And so when the meeting ended, everyone came over to me and said, what happened? How did you get this account? Something's wrong. I said, I don't know. They picked me. So it worked out really well. And we learned a lot from that. Now, the multi-branding strategy didn't work. The multi-branding strategy never really panned out. We wound up doing about 155 locations for them, and my cohorts each did around the same number, but they never revamped the entire country. It was so complicated because think about it for a minute. When you're doing food processing, you don't want your chicken to taste like pizza, right? And all of this is being combined. So from an architect's perspective, we were trying to figure out how do you get all this preparation done. And of course, what the board of directors is saying to me, we want the restaurant smaller. We don't want them bigger. So they're basically compressing the kitchens down. It was a very challenging account. These are some of the other companies that we've done 10 or more projects with around the country, some of them 50, 60 projects. And we're offering the same sorts of services to them. And we continue to this day representing these companies, most of which are publicly traded. So it brings me to some project examples now. The Mike Fasano Regional Hurricane Shelter. In 2005, we had a really bad storm that affected some of you guys in this area. What was the storm called? Katrina. And so what happened post-Katrina? Speak up. I'm not gonna. What happened? Well, no, I'm talking about immediately past Katrina. When they tried to house the people in New Orleans, what happened in the Superdome? Really bad stuff. Not stuff that should happen in America, right? I mean, it was really bad. Everyone remember that? So, our FEMA director very discreetly went out on a mission after that storm. He went on a workshop mission, and he held workshops around the country, and he decided he wasn't going to allow that to happen again. And they systematically determined where the weaknesses were in our coastlines. And if a hurricane ever hit again, which housing stock, which population was most vulnerable to a storm and not able to mobilize and get out of town. So FEMA issued what they called hazard mitigation grants. They came up with this novel concept that they were going to build massive hurricane shelters all over the coastlines, and they were going to start in Florida. Does it sound like a good use of taxpayer dollars? I don't know. We'll see. So and so because it's the federal government, they couldn't just accept the regular Cat 5 wind speed, the 157 miles an hour. The FEMA director, Craig Fugate at the time, who was still a friend, and I think a lot of him, he said, you know what? I want all these shelters designed at 190 miles an hour. And I said, Craig, they don't make materials at 190 miles an hour. That's a tornado. No, I want it at 190 miles an hour. Okay. So several counties in Florida took the money. This is millions of dollars now that was issued. And RFPs went out summer 2007 for design-build proposals. Now everyone knows design-build versus design-bid-build. They wanted to do these things design-build. Here's the key. Anyone ever study the FEMA 361 manuals? I had one in my office. I used to walk by it. I never touched it until this happened. And the FEMA director said, I want all of the hurricane shelters designed to this standard. Well, this is not a code, FEMA 361. And you guys should write this down, those of you who are interested, because you can Google this stuff later. It's very fascinating. So 361 was really a guidance document. And by the way, it was a tornado shelter document, not a hurricane shelter document. But that's all they could grab. That's all they knew. It wasn't their fault. They just didn't have the knowledge of any other options. So my county that my office is in didn't think this was complicated enough. They decided they wanted to make it LEED. The first LEED project in Pasco County, the first LEED project on the west coast of Florida. It's not complicated enough. Let's make it a little bit more complicated. And we'll compress the time frames on top of that. So the project, in this particular project, was required to house 1,000 people, plus the staff, roughly 65 staff, for 72 hours. Now, if you remember Katrina, what happened in the Superdome? There was no power, no food, no water, no bathroom facilities. People actually died from heat stroke. So in this building, they said, if the world is devastated, we want all of those services for a minimum of 3 days for 1,000 people plus staff. Which means we had to embed a health clinic in this building. We had to embed a full commercial kitchen in this building. We had to be able to be totally self-contained for 3 days. Plus, we had to meet the wind speed stuff. One final thing. Does anyone know what a slosh elevation is? Anyone study sloshes? So, I didn't either until I had to do this. You guys are all familiar with 100-year floodplain maps. When you design a hurricane shelter, you've got to be above the slosh elevation. So, in theory, if a Cat 5 storm hits perpendicular to the land, it's going to drive the water up about 2.5 times your base flood elevation. So I mean, it's driving the water up in some cases 20, 25 feet high. Trying to find a site that FEMA was satisfied with above the slosh elevation was virtually impossible. We drove and mapped things over and over again until we could accomplish this, and we finally found an area that they were satisfied with. So here's the big thing. 11 counties had options to take the money. 3 counties kept the money. All the rest of them gave it back. Because FEMA said to all the county commissioners, if you take this money, you build this facility, and we don't certify it, you need to write us a check back. And the other counties were not willing to do that. So I want to stop here for a minute. All these other counties had very reputable design firms working for them. I wasn't doing all these projects. I was only on the Pasco project. Why do you think the other firms said it couldn't be done? That's right. They had gotten locked in. It's a pretty amazing concept, right? They had gotten locked in to this paradigm that, you know what, here are the rules. This is it. It doesn't fit the box. We're not going to be able to do it. Get the money back. We didn't see it that way. Because I had constantly beat on my staff about looking outside the parameters of our industry, you know what we did? What do you think we did? We said change the litmus test. Go to a different code. We said, you know what, Craig, now I didn't know Craig well at the time. It's not like little local architects get to talk to the FEMA director until you have this kind of issue. And I said, you're using the wrong code. You're not using the right document for this type of project. You need to use ICC 500. Everyone knows the ICC codes, right? You guys are familiar with those? So ICC 500 is a document, by the way, which was not finished when I suggested we use it. The only way I found out about it is I had contacted a professor at Texas Tech at the Wind Institute. And he happened to be sitting on the board that was drafting this. And I happened to be on the phone one day just talking about the problem we were having with FEMA. And he said, you know what, you guys ought to look at this code. It's not been adopted, but I bet you could give it to them in draft form and they'll accept it. It didn't happen that easily, but we got it to them. And eventually the federal government changed the standard and they took our advice and they used ICC 500. Now that didn't make it a lot easier, but at least it gave us the parameters so we could design a building that we could actually get built. They authorized us to proceed in the fall of 2008. We started in April 2009 and finished November 2009. And it's a very short time frame, but being the person I am, I felt like I needed to make a point to our county commissioners and our state legislators and our governor, because everyone at this point had decided this couldn't be done. So our county commission chairman had me stand up at a commission meeting, full room, much crowd, more crowded than this, and he brought me to the podium and he said, now Mr. Bekesh, if we give you this contract and FEMA doesn't accept it, we want you to say here under oath that you will reimburse the county the $8 million for this building. And I said, okay. Of course, my staff is sitting behind me and they all hung their heads down. And I said, I'll do it. I'm confident we can figure it out. We got the cognitive horsepower in our organization that you present us with a challenge, we'll figure it out. Now, a lot of my staff didn't feel that way. They thought I was nuts. But we worked this very hard. And so here's some examples of this. You put 1,000 people in a building, they got to shower, right? They got to eat, you got to prep food. All those things have to be done. The codes didn't determine the fixture counts for hurricane shelters, so we had to develop our own model to put the right fixture counts in. These were things that were uncharted territory. There are no textbooks to figure this stuff out. The walls. Is everyone in the room familiar with the missile impact test? Do you guys study any of that stuff? So when we design high wind velocity buildings, we have to be able to withstand horizontal and vertical missile tests. So they launch a 2x4 at the building at 190 miles an hour to see what it's going to penetrate through. Because the worst thing that happens to a building during a storm is if you have a breach in the structure, the wind can get in and basically rip the building apart. So the reason we're so focused on the envelope is to prevent the wind from getting into the structure. The problem is most building materials cannot withstand the 190 mile an hour missile test. The building industry didn't design their windows and their vents and their doors for 190 miles an hour, which caused a whole nother problem for me. How do you put materials on this building, right? It's a pretty significant problem because I had to finish the building. So my friends at Texas Tech, at the Wind Institute, we started getting together on wall types. This is a 12-inch CMU wall. Build cells the entire building. Number 5 is 24 inches in center, and horizontal and vertical tie beams. It is like a bomb shelter. We feel pretty confident a tornado can cross this building and it won't touch this building. Here's another issue, power. Because in New Orleans there was no power, they wanted this facility to run for 72 hours. This generator here was custom built for us. It weighs a little over 20,000 pounds. And you see what we're doing there with it? It doesn't fit through the door, guys. So we had to order this, design it, lift it, and drop it in the building before we could put the roof on. And it sits on a 40-inch thick slab on those vibration isolators there. All custom designed for this particular facility. Water. Have to have water for almost 1,100 people for 3 days. So couldn't put it below ground because it triggers different EPA issues in Florida. We had to put it above ground. But FEMA's not happy with that because FEMA looks at anything that's an ancillary portion of the building. They say, well, Rich, that water tank has to withstand 190 mile an hour missile test. Try to find a tank that meets the 190 mile an hour missile test. So we had to design our own double wall steel tanks and have them custom built to hold the water in it. Sanitary sewer. Just like in New Orleans, the FEMA folks said, you've got to withhold all the sanitary sewer on site. We're not going to let you rely on any pump station. So all that's designed in this building. Windows. This is a big one, and this challenge took a lot of time, and we almost didn't think we'd have this fixed. All the glass on the building is rated for 150 mile an hour impact, but 150 mile an hour is not good enough for FEMA. So we had to develop what we call armor screen. The armor screen is clamped on the sides to each window. Each window has their own specific armor screen. The armor screen had to be shipped to Texas Tech. We had to change the formula in the product and the reinforcement on the sides because every time we would test this, the missile would penetrate it. Finally, we got one that worked. We sent it to Washington and they approved it. So we were the first building in America to use this armor screen. Now it's being used at counties and cities across the world. Here's another issue. So FEMA, and this is where sometimes the federal government perplexes me. We have a fully air-conditioned facility on a backup generator that costs about $500,000. But FEMA said, just in case the generator goes out, you have to provide 100% ventilation in this building for 1,100 people. We had a hard time with that because it doesn't really make sense. But they insisted on it. Well, if you guys, this is what the back side of that looks like. So these are triggered and they come on to bring fresh air to the building. Because if you have 1,000 people in an environment, let's face it, you gotta have some fresh air, right? And no manufacturer makes one of these things rated over 120 miles an hour. No one. And they're not willing to make one over 120 miles an hour. So it left us with this dilemma. What do we do? FEMA would not give up on this because technically, if you guys follow what I'm saying, you really don't need fresh air ventilation because you're bringing that in through the HVAC system. So this was a redundant system. It wasn't necessary, but we all got hung up arguing about this. And finally I said, we're going to figure it out. We're going to create our own shields. We'll put them on the outside of the ventilation. So when the vents kick on, it'll be protected. And this is how we solved it. So we had all these custom made. We sent them to the testing lab. We tested them. We proved that they worked, and we put them on the building. This is, anyone recognize our governor, Charlie Crist? He's now a congressman. He came to the ceremony. Most of the senior management at FEMA came. It was a pretty big deal. And this is our LEAD education platform. For those of you familiar with LEAD, raise your hand. Okay, awesome. So one of the components of LEAD is you have to embed an educational component into the project. Now, LEAD was brand new to us. We had never done a LEAD project before this. So as you walk into this facility, this is the map that kind of illustrates where in the building we implemented the LEAD features. And so it's been kind of a neat thing because the schools in our community now bring kids here to see this project. And we walk them through to teach them about sustainability. That's our hurricane shelter. So I'm going to speed through these next two pretty quickly. In 2005, we had a building boom in our country. And in 2007, we had a collapse, the Great Recession, right? The Great Recession is a classic example of you don't know what you don't know, right? Why? Because the mortgage-backed securities were totally unknown to the big banks that were investing in them. They didn't know what they were investing in. They didn't understand the risks. And when they all collapsed, they took the banks with them. This organization was formed. This is ST Residential. It's 5 organizations combined into one. I like to call them Starwood, so if you hear me say Starwood, it's interchangeable with ST. Starwood Capital is the primary parent company here. Starwood, ST, merged with the FDIC because the FDIC had to take over Chorus Bank. Chorus Bank was the largest funder of condos in our country during the boom. They had lent out about $5 billion. That bank collapsed one afternoon. So it left a couple of hundred tower projects unfinished around America, and the FDIC found themselves holding the bag. They couldn't do it on their own, so they had to partner with someone. These guys became their partner. These guys, the organizations involved in here were my clients already. They came to me and said, we need you to be our problem solver. Is anyone familiar with the movie Pulp Fiction? There's the guy, Mr. Wolf. What's Mr. Wolf do? He solves problems, right? I'll never forget the CEO saying, you're Mr. Wolf, Rich. Solve the problem. So here's a tower on Waikiki Beach in Honolulu. I get a call one day that this project might be going into litigation. Now remember, the government is basically the owner of these buildings. And a prestigious law firm in Nevada is trying to do a class action lawsuit in Waikiki Beach on all the buildings built between 2003 and 2007. So they just lumped our client's building in that. And this particular law firm was successful in Nevada in doing a case, a class action against a Propex supplier. Is everyone familiar with Propex piping? Have you heard of Propex? Propex is a plumbing system. And when we had the boom in our country, in Florida, we don't allow Propex, by the way, but some states allow Propex. When we had the boom in our country, all the plumbers wanted to go to Propex because it's what? Cheaper and faster, okay? So Propex is an interesting system. This is a leg of Propex piping here. It's a polymer. And it fits to a copper pipe with a brass fitting. So you could have basically a washing machine, a toilet, whatever it was, you had to have a brass fitting, which is specially designed by a company called Uponor to attach a Propex pipe to. The attorney was alleging that the brass fittings, does anyone know what brass is made of in the room? It's copper and zinc. It's primarily copper, but zinc's added to it. The small firm was alleging that all the Uponor fittings on Honolulu Beach were defective because they had too much zinc in them. And so if you remember that picture, that big tower I showed you, 35 stories high, he was basically telling all the owners that every single one of those pipes were going to leak and you'd have waterfalls coming down your $1 million units. So he got them all worked up. I get the call to solve this. Now, I didn't know anything about Uponor and Propex. Never even heard of it because we don't use it in our region. But I had to set up a protocol to test it. I had to go to this tower, and I had to cut the walls in people's units and be very systematic about this because I knew I might be defending this in court one day. So we bagged and tagged everything in this particular building, and we were very, very defined about how we were selecting per floor. So we'd go into someone's unit, we'd rip out the Uponor, we'd hire someone to fix it because we had to put everything back the way it was, and then we'd package all this stuff and send it to a organization that analyzes metal, which teamed with me. So this is a Propex fitting right here. And that's a Propex ring. Again, I'm not a metal scientist, but I was faced with this challenge and I had to figure it out. So we knew that we needed to study these. And we had to prove to the law firm our building was okay. So we cut those fittings, and then we started analyzing them for zinc. And we found out through all of our testing, because ASTM establishes criteria for the amount of zinc in a fitting, that these fittings were okay. So that's a magnified view of that fitting. Here on the fitting is something very interesting. This is a foundry number to stamp. And after we get all these results back, we feel pretty good. There's nothing wrong with our fittings. We should get out of this lawsuit. But I still wasn't comfortable because the attorney had fittings that were leaking, that we knew there was too much zinc. And I couldn't figure out why his fittings were leaking and mine seemed okay. And I started thinking about this. You know what they put on this? This is a foundry stamp number. So every time they produce more than 10,000 fittings, they change the stamp on the machine. So I went back and checked the stamp from the ones that were bad, and I started comparing all the bad stamps to the ones we had shown. And I went to Uponor and said, when did you run these fittings versus the ones in the lawsuit? And we demonstrated to the law firm in Los Angeles that our fittings were perfectly fine. And we got out of this case. It was about a $50 million lawsuit for this particular building. Now, what do you think all the other buildings on Waikiki Beach did? What do you think? Oh, they called me. We got so many calls because of this. This was all under an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, so no one knew how we got extracted from this because the law firm did not want anyone to hear this stuff. But somehow, even with an NDA, all this spread through Honolulu Beach. And then the final project, and this is another classic example of not having any knowledge. This is Riverside in Buckhead. And Riverside, this is another ST project, part of the FDIC collapse. Again, I get the call on this one. And there's a little elderly lady that lives in this complex. These units run from about $300,000 to $700,000. And she's going to sell her unit. And she goes out and buys a little radon test kit. You guys have seen those little radon test kits? And she puts it on the floor. And it comes back 400 times the EPA level for radon. Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer in our country. It's a significant problem. She's confused. She goes down to the building manager and says, Tom, I think I did this wrong. Could you help me? He gets one, and it's like 900 times the EPA. I get a call. I'm on vacation. We have a problem. Get the bucket. And I said, wait, what's the issue? Oh, there's radon levels. I said, well, she's probably probably on the ground floor. You know, it's probably coming up through the slab. We can fix that. No, Rich, she's on the 5th floor. I said, wait a minute, she's on the 5th floor? We have radon at that level on the 5th floor. There's kids in this building. I mean, there's young families living in this complex. I had to get on the plane. I go here. I teamed up with the radon expert for the federal government that I had met through FEMA. And we developed a solution to put these radon kits in test pots. We set the test pots all over this giant complex late one night. We were very, very systematic about how we did this. Test pot would sit there, we'd bake it for 12 hours, and then we'd come back, monitor it, record all the levels. And the levels were really high. In some cases, they were 1,100 times the EPA levels. And then we'd identify which floors were the worst. Now, what do you think was causing this radon? So, what's in concrete? Aggregate, granite. So you mix concrete with water, cement, and aggregate, right? They had mined the aggregate from a radon-infested pit. And they put it in a gigantic building with thousands of people. And it was everywhere. And I had to hold a community meeting with about 2,000 very unhappy people, and I had to tell them one evening, you have radon everywhere in your complex. But I'm going to fix it. We're going to figure out how to solve it. Now, we gave them a chance. We said, I didn't say this, the client said this, we'll buy your units back. If you guys want out, we'll buy. But because of Buckhead and the proximity to downtown, people want to live here. So, what do? You just have to start studying. You have to figure out the problem. How do you solve it? You can only solve radon problems by diluting the air. You have to bring in air to lower the radon levels. That sounds pretty easy, right? I mean, but how do you get fresh air into 600 condo units? And each condo unit, by the way, has a different level of radon. So we set up these test kits. These are little exhaust fans that we hooked into the windows of every unit. It took us about 6 months to analyze this problem. I had staff there every day. And we determined how much air we needed to bring in to get the radon levels to where they were safe. This machine tells us when they come down to safe levels. And we had to modify the entire building to bring in fresh air. And when it was all done, it cost our client around $10 million to do this, but it would have cost them $100 million in lawsuits. When it was all done, we only had one person want their money back from the unit. Everyone else stayed. So it was a big success. The moral of the story is we didn't know anything about radon. I had no knowledge about radon. And it's just imperative that when you go out into the workforce, you embrace this idea of analyzing and looking at problems through a wide lens. Don't get narrow perspective on things. It's so important that you continue learning, you get in the habit of self-teaching. And I can guarantee you that if you're determined to learn, determined to strengthen your mind, you will be successful. So, thank you very much. Those of you on Facebook, who are on Facebook, if you want to look at some of our projects, we have some recent projects up there. We'd love for you to like us and follow us. So, any questions? That's my presentation, guys. I hope you like it.
Rich will be going to the studio, and we'll take some questions now. But we don't want anybody to leave before we take a question and give from the president. Sure.
All of these. Yeah, I mean, you go to bed and you're thinking, can we figure that out? I mean, it's one of those things that but you know, the next day, the sun rises and you go back in the office and everyone sits around the table and we go, yeah, you know what, let's look at it this way. So the hurricane shelter is a classic example that we didn't know if we could really do it. We didn't know. but we were confident in our ability to solve the problem. Now, fortunately, FEMA agreed with us and changed the parameters. If they had stuck to their guns in 361, I would have been writing a check to the county because I could have never met. No one asked me, by the way, there were 2 other hurricane shelters that counties that took money. You know what happened to those? I got the other one, so I designed another one. City of Tampa did one. And I got a call from the FEMA director because the project did not meet the criteria. But instead of having a big press catastrophe, they asked me to go in there to modify that building, to fix it, so they wouldn't have to give the money. So we wound up doing all 3.
Question, there you go.
I have a more of a detailed question. So with the ventilation for the radon, how did you end up ventilating the building to get the different amount of air into the different?
Great question. Every single unit has a constant flow ventilation device where we're bringing outside air in, and it treats the air, because when you bring outside air in, what happens? You're bringing in moisture into the space. And then every unit owner was given 5 years predictive energy costs in a check, because you have to remember, these units have to run 24/7. That radon will be in this building for 1,000 years. So that was the settlement that we came up with, and every single unit has a different volume to make sure the radon levels. And then we go in periodically now, and we still check the radon levels to make sure they never came up.
And I actually had one more question.
Sure.
About the hurricane shelter. So you had said that if the backup generator failed, you needed to have a total natural ventilation system. But you made it sound like the ventilation system was based on a sensor, which then would need the power. But if there's no power, would you then manually open them?
Yeah, well, they can be manually opened, but if you're familiar with emergency power versus permanent power, so your emergency systems are on a separate power source, so your exit lights in this room, those sorts of things are on a separate power source, and all of those motors have battery backups on them, which allow them to run for about 10 minutes. So all the fan motors run on the battery backup until the permanent power kicks back on.
Yeah, what's the most important skills you obtained when you graduated from university, which need to use this?
What's the most important skill?
Yes.
I would tell you my critical thinking skill, my desire to solve problems, and the passion that Southern Miss gave me for learning and growing.
What are those quick thinking and is learn from class, or is there personal?
I think it's a combination of both. It's a good question, and I talk to corporate clients about critical thinking all the time. You have to get in the habit of being aware. Okay, so one of the ways you improve critical thinking is through awareness, right? If you're aware of what's out there, then you're aware of where to turn. You may not always know the answer to the problem, but you need to know where to go to find the answer. That's what I want you to take from this. Know that there's a path. In the hurricane shelter, it was Texas Tech. In the radon path, I went back to FEMA. There's always a path. That's the critical thinking skill that each of you need to take when you leave here. Corporations are wanting that. They're wanting folks that can solve problems in an innovative fashion. Good question. Awesome.
Well, thank you very much. We are going to continue interacting with Richard, but it'll take place in the community studio at about 2:30 to 3. We're just going to look at some work. I wanted to thank you again. We have a present from you and while I'm here, we have to thank the Foundation Office for introducing us to the school construction we're in the school. We have to thank, if you will, the Mississippi State Board of Contractors who sponsors the Leadership Lecture Series, and the student instructors who are hosting you as you're here. And all of us are very grateful for you to be here. And we have one little present from us to give to you. And then we have something from students. Yeah.
guys have